In this video, we're going to look at polling error and bias. It's a popular media narrative that polls are consistently getting it wrong. They point to election results in America, whether it be the 2016 election, 2018, 2020, or even 2022, to suggest that polls are misreading the electorate. But are they? Are polls really getting it wrong? We're going to explore some issues around polling accuracy and bias. For starters, what are we talking about when we say polling error? Well, polling error is the difference between what we think is going to happen and what does happen. Here's how it might look. Let's say we've got pre-election polls. The red party or the red candidate has 52%. The blue candidate has 48%. When we look at the difference, the margin, that would suggest a 4% margin of victory. We compare that to the actual results on election day, which are typically different. Now let's say on election day, the actual margin was 2%. So we thought it was going to be a 4% victory, ended up being a 2% victory. We then take the difference, and that is what's called the polling error. Our error would be 2% because our estimate was off from 2% compared to the actual election results. Now 2% isn't bad. When you get up around 6, 7, 8, 9%, that's not really close. 2%, that's actually a pretty good guess considering how complicated predicting human behavior can be. Just some examples of polling error. In the United States at presidential elections, it's difficult. They have the electoral college system, which doesn't really represent the true preferences of the electorate. And we can see that there have been some sources of polling error. 2016, the one election that people often cite as the polls getting it wrong, they weren't actually too bad. This is according to 538's projections. Their projections were off by less than 2%. That's actually more accurate than the elections preceding and following it. Now, overall, in American presidential elections, election polling has gotten pretty good. Polling error has actually been on a gradual decline. Aside from some ups and downs over the years, we can see the trend. Polls are, on average, getting more accurate. It's also different when we look at American congressional elections because this is more of a representation of public preferences. They don't have to worry about the Electoral College mediating those preferences. And we can see again, sometimes the polls are pretty good, sometimes they're off by a little. We can even look at 2018 where 538 was exactly right. Polling error was 0. So there's some examples of misses, but by and large, polls are pretty close. Now, when we talk about polling bias, that's something different. Polling error is how much you're off by. Polling bias is the direction. And it's possible that everybody trying to predict an election could be off in the same direction. They might overestimate one party's chances. We would call that polling bias, when the error all runs in the same direction. Now, more realistically, what happens is that individual polling firms might be biased. In this graphic of the 2022 U.S. midterm elections, we can see that polls were biased in different directions based on their polling firms. The Trafalgar Group, which was very prolific, they ran a lot of election polls in the run-up to the election, they were off by about 6% overall. On the other side, we can see Civics and YouGov, they were off in the other direction. They were overestimating the Democratic turnout. Some of the most accurate pollsters tend to be those that are associated with university and college research centers. The Siena poll, Emerson College, Marist poll, they are all affiliated with academic research centers, and they tend to be more accurate than some of the more partisan outlets. What about Canada? Well, in Canada, the Canadian polling firms are pretty accurate consistently. In this brief snapshot from 338.com, we can see that they're usually within a couple percentage points of predicting the election results, whether it be provincial level or the federal level. Canadian polling firms do a pretty accurate job. 338 Canada, Philip Fournier, runs what's called a polling aggregator. It's when you take the results of a whole bunch of different individual polling outlets and you try and put them together into an aggregate measure, use that to project who's going to win elections. And it's sort of a garbage in, garbage out mentality. If the polls are good, then you should be able to have a pretty solid prediction. And it turns out that it is pretty accurate. In the 2022 Quebec election, 338 Canada almost nailed it. They were only off by a couple seats. and a very similar result in the 2021 Canadian federal election. Polls and the results pretty darn close. So in Canada anyway, election polls have been pretty accurate. So just to recap, sum everything up, can polls get it wrong? Yeah, sometimes polls do get it wrong. Polling error happens. It can depend on the type of election, where the election is being held, and also the type of pollster. And that's where bias comes in. Sometimes pollsters are deliberately trying to show that their party is ahead, and that can lead to a general bias in the polling data that we see. Overall, election polling is pretty good. It's gotten a lot better with time.